Everyone, I'm here at Economics Matters, the podcast with an old-time friend, a young old friend, David Barboza, who I met, I guess, when you were an undergraduate at Boston University, and then you went on to Yale to get a degree uh, uh, in history, right?
Yes.
And then you ended up becoming a super famous journalist with the New York Times, with a lot of work on well, all kinds of things, but then ending up focusing on China. I'm going to let you kind of fill in your biography a bit, David. And then we're going to turn to, I'm going to have to be your proud father or mother and just convey a bit about the enormous number of prizes you've gotten. So don't get it, don't reveal that secret. I'll come back to those, and then we'll start talking about what's going on in the world because you're as well situated as anyone to discuss our international global uh, economy and politics. This could not be, from a historical and perspective, geopolitical perspective, a more interesting time. Not necessarily a happy time or fun time, but a scary time in many ways. But David, where were you born? And give
Yeah,
us a quick, tour of David Barboza. Okay.
sure. Great to be with you again after all these years. So I grew up in Massachusetts, in the whaling city of New Bedford, and I finished high school in New York City, right here in New York City, where I am now. I was an undergraduate at Boston University when you were a distinguished professor there and knew about the economics department because for a little while I was working on a book on John Silber, who may have recruited you to the university. And that interest in really writing about John Silber started with my fascination with reporting, but also investigative reporting and kind of history, but modern history. So um, I read it while I was in an undergrad. I read Robert Caro's biographies of Lyndon Johnson. I think The Path to Power was the first one that came out, and I said, "This is what I want to do." He's a journalist who does investigative reporting and also a historian, and now, like, I think one of the greatest historians ever of American history. I finally got to meet and interview Robert Caro for the New York Times. So I kind of wanted to follow that while I was at Boston University as an undergraduate, that investigative journalism, starting at the newspaper, but also someday historian path. And that led me to the New York Times, which I was an intern in Boston. I was an intern in New York. I ended up joining the Times as a staff writer after graduate school at Yale in history. And I was still thinking about my book about the history of American higher education using John Silber as my model. My other model, by the way, was J. Anthony Lucas. And you probably remember J. Anthony Lucas's book on the Boston public school system, Common Ground, which won a Pulitzer, I think, when I was at BU. Uh,
Okay.
so these two kind of very deep journalist historians, that was my interest. But I ended up dropping the book. I spent some time in Texas. Silber was quite disappointed when I said the New York Times has offered to hire me as a reporter in New York. This was 1997 as a staff writer. I
Right.
joined the Times, covered the stock market in 97, 98, moved to Chicago as the Chicago business correspondent in 1998 through 2003. Uh, One of those years I spent living in Houston covering the collapse of Enron. So I got to sort of try out my skills as an investigative reporter covering Enron for a full year out of a hotel in
Wow.
a living in a hotel, I think, for 5 months and then in a corporate apartment while I was based in Chicago. So it was great. Of course, the Times says we're going to have you as a full-time correspondent on one company and you're going to investigate them. So after Enron, I went back briefly to Chicago, and the Times offered me a position as a business reporter in China. I moved there in 2004. I learned Chinese. Not that I learned so well in that short period of time, but I learned some Chinese. I moved in 2004 to Shanghai, and the job of my life, my dream job, is to be a foreign correspondent for the Times as a business and investigative reporter, and also an economics reporter to some degree, and spent 12 years actually, when I left, I was the longest serving China correspondent ever for the Times. They had never, 12 years is extraordinary. Usually it's 3 to 5 years for a foreign posting. So I got really lucky. I got multiple terms in China covering, I think, just one of the greatest business and economic stories of our time. Less on politics, more on business and economics, which we can talk about. And that's sort of I came back in 2016. I continued to cover China. And then, as I was talking to you just before we started this broadcast, that I left the Times in 2019 to found a company that really started inside of the Times with the idea that we would do both news and data, and that my other love, being an investigative journalist, was what do we do with all the data we're collecting, all the information, all the archives that we're throwing out? And I wanted to create a tool to help not only me as a journalist, but also to help other journalists, think tanks, academics, business people. How do you comprehend the business world in something a little different than a Bloomberg terminal or your Google or Wikipedia search engine?
So what's the name of the company now? That because you have a combination of a data company and then a kind of a news service, right?
Right, right. So the company's called The Wire Digital, founded in 2019. Sequoia, as I told you, invested in 2020, and then in our Series A in 2022. Wire Digital has a news division called The Wire China, which is kind of a business magazine about business and economics in China. So it's a China-focused business magazine, comes out weekly. But also we have this data platform called WireScreen, like a screen, like you're screening companies. And that is, think of it like a Bloomberg terminal or a PitchBook platform where you can search information about businesses, companies, ownership, relationships, investments, but private companies as well as public. Bloomberg is mostly publicly traded companies. We do private and public with a focus initially on China, but the idea is to be a global platform, so you can understand supply chains, business relationships, risk, all sorts of things about companies.
Wow. Okay. So where would somebody go if they wanted to, let's say, become one of your clients, customers?
Well, they'd go to our website, wirescreen.ai, and they would send us one of those emails or try out either the Wire China, which is the wirechina.com, thewirechina.com, which they could subscribe to the news platform, or they could message us on wirescreen.ai, which is the data platform.
And this has become a wildly successful company in whatever, 4 or 5 years, right? I mean, you've gone
That's right.
massive, I won't say unless you want to, massive valuation. So let me put it this way, David, when you're in Boston next, you're going to take me to dinner.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's all paper money at the moment because we're a Series A. I'm sure you understand a Series A startup seed Series A.
You're going to take me and the president of the university to dinner, who's going to
Yes.
put her hand on your arm and say, David, time to give back. But anyway, let me tell, David looks like just like, a nice standard kind of guy who, okay, so he's worked for the Times, been in China, worked on Enron, which is like the biggest company scandal of the post-war period, where the company was booking profits and leaving off future obligations. So and then the top brass was getting paid on the stock value, so they're kicking up the stock value, and it's a huge scandal. Brought down, what was it? Which company stock was it? Anderson Cooper that brought down?
Yes.
Yeah, Anderson Cooper. So we had like 5 top CPA firms, accounting firms,
That's
and
right.
one of them just eviscerated, just disappeared because the government said, "You guys have been so corrupt, you're out of here. You're gone. You can't work. You're just out of business. We're not going to let you operate." It was that bad. And David, you were the one who was kind of exposing all this over
Yeah.
this period of time. But let me just mention a few things about David that he's being too modest to say. So in 2013, he received the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting with a bunch of other New York Times columnists or writers. And they were looking at they did a penetrating analysis of business practices by Apple and other technology companies that shows the darker side of this changing global economy for both the workers and consumers. I'm just reading from Wikipedia, okay? So, but also in the same year, 2013, David wins another Pulitzer Prize for reporting about Chinese government corruption at the highest level, including billions of secret wealth owned by relatives of the prime minister. And I'm surprised you actually got out of China in one piece, having done that. You received in 2007, you received the Society of American Business Editors and Writers Business Journalist of the Year awards, one from the for a New York Times. You were, I guess, again, two awards here. It looks like you got one from the New York for a New York Times article, "A Chinese Reformer Betrays His Cause and Pays." And I'm not sure whether this is, let's see, you received, Cebu, 2 awards. I'm not sure what the other one was. Then you got in 2008, a Grantham Prize for environmental reporting on choking on growth and China's environmental crisis. Then you worked on the Enron scandal. You became a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize on that coverage of the Enron scandal. And then you earned 3 Gerald Loeb Awards. And then the list just goes on here. You've got other kind of sharing awards. And well, anyway, you are a big deal. And I want to thank you for joining us. And now I want to raise the biggest question of the day, which is what the hell is going on in the world here? How do you read what's going on? It seems like Trump has become or is or has been a Russian agent, that every action he's taking and his adherent, his folks, whether it's the vice president, the secretary of defense, the secretary of state, they're all following his lead, Elon Musk. So we have Trump spouting the Russian line on Ukraine, taking the Russian position, telling the Europeans and NATO, in effect, to get lost, telling everybody in the world that grabbing land, if you can do it, is just fine. You can threaten to take Panama, and if they don't agree, take it. You can make Canada the 51st state. How we do it, so we'll decide. Greenland, that looks like a nice place to take. Let's take it. Gaza, lots of great hotel space there. It's mine. And in the same time, he's telling Russia, more or less, you're justified in taking over Ukraine. If you can take more of it, go ahead. We'll try and make things to come to an end if we can get Ukraine to give us half of their rare earth minerals for free, I guess. We've put in, I think, $120 billion. We want to take back $500 billion worth of their minerals, I guess, for free. And if they don't like it, they can talk to the Russians, but we're kind of out of NATO. And then with the Chinese, seems like it's an invitation to take Taiwan. We've got our manifest destiny. You've got yours. Go for it. Is that your reading of what's going on here? Or am I being too too overblown.
Well, I was saying to you earlier, Larry, when we were just starting on the call that, wow, the world seems a mess. But, what Trump does is really not my area of expertise. I don't think I'm a very good analyst of Trump, and I am actually skeptical that many people who predicted what he was going to be like as president the second time could predict. Already, you've seen in his first only like 5 weeks in office, even for what you might have said about the first term, I don't think could have predicted the things we're starting to see, or at least maybe they said, well, maybe he might be a little softer on Russia, but probably they wouldn't be predicting this the way it is. But I don't think I have great insight into Trump. I do have lots of questions about this is dealt a lot in the early days with DEI and with federal workers and with the budget and lots of other things. What we have only seen a glimpse of on China is what they released, I think, Friday, which is a new executive order regarding, I think it's called America First investment policy. So a lot of questions have been, okay, so we know Trump was kind of closer to Putin. We thought things wouldn't be looking that good for Ukraine. Of course, I'm not trying to downplay any of the things that you said, but we haven't yet heard what are the policies towards China, except this executive order and his appointment of Rubio, of different people, Peter Navarro, and others. So it looks like it's still a little bit hardline on China, but maybe some people think Ukraine could be a signal that he's going to make a deal with China on Taiwan or on tariffs or on something else. So that's not that I have any great insight into which way it will go, but I kind of think the place where the country is today, beyond Trump, is China is a huge trading partner. It's a strategic rival. It's a foreign adversary. There's deep seek. We can talk about that in all sorts of things. On the area I've been focusing on, which is China, and U.S. relations, wow, it has been. I mean, even though the things you listed were pretty dramatic, the relationship with China from the time I went there as a reporter for the Times to today, no one could have predicted, even take Trump out of the picture, could have predicted what was going to happen with China. How could they get so close in many ways, except over human rights, with the US, and then everything blows up in the way it has, and now they're seen as enemy number one, maybe above Russia, right? Because it seems Russia's not the enemy anymore. Who is the enemy? It's some of our allies, and it's China.
Yeah. And so I was just over in China with my wife in September for about 17 days. The
Mm.
thing that struck me was there was no non well, there were Chinese Americans coming back on the plane, but there non the number of it's called white Americans on the flight and in town in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, essentially none. Same thing with Europeans. So, and then, you get the impression that the security levels were very, very high in China. They've got every street in Shanghai has eight cameras. So I think that is kind of off-putting for foreign tourists. Uh, but then I talked to a lot of people when I was there, and there was a sense that Chinese, what we've seen here in the academy is that Chinese students aren't applying, and this is putting a huge, producing a huge uh, financial problem for Boston University, for other universities. We were relying a lot on Chinese students coming and paying their tuition and occupying our housing. So why is that? I think the notion is that if you come and get your passport stamped in the US, maybe years later, you might not be able to get a job, maybe not a job with the government, at least, which is a big employer. Uh, this feels like I have a friend who was involved in the Cultural Revolution. He was sent to a rice farm, and then he got a better job for about a year. And then the Cultural Revolution folks came by and looked at his and started asking him whether he had any relatives in Taiwan. This was and Taiwan was a long time before this exchange. And he said, "Well, I think I have a far distant cousin that I never met who might be in Taiwan." Bingo, he was picked up and sent back to the rice farm.
Wow.
Yeah. So I have a long memory here. And so being on the wrong side of having that in your passport or their digital records, what do you take to be the current stance of relations with? I mean, I've been going back since around 1990 to China. It's about my fifth trip, and it just seemed very different, as you were indicating.
Right. And I think one of your students, is it Jin Li Trin is
Jin
one of
Yun Kai. Jin Yun Kai was a student of mine.
right,
Yeah.
right. So very successful in China. So my view is like, everything is flipped around. And for the as far as the students, it's not only how the Chinese government would view the students and the opportunities coming back, or the suspicions you're too close to the US, or China right now is really looking into a lot of national security things as the US is, which is, are you a spy for the US?
Yeah.
So, but also, as you probably know, those students and even professors worry that the US is not as welcoming a place as it was in the 80s and 90s when we were at university, and they were coming from China after 89, to all the major universities and being welcomed there and then staying on to become citizens. So I've heard lots of scientists have returned to China. There's suspicions in the US that they could be spies for China. There's suspicions in China you could be spies for the US. So I think, um, not only academics, but even entrepreneurs that are in the middle of this US-China relations are caught in the middle, right? Am I an entrepreneur who's too close to American? If I'm a Chinese entrepreneur, and am I an American entrepreneur doing business with the Chinese government, which you have to if you're a major company, your partner, whether you're Disney or Apple, you're partnering with the Chinese government. Not, I don't mean just that they let you in the country. They're literally often your business partner, your joint venture partner, building your facilities, giving you subsidies. So the relationships are very challenging for anyone to think about. Actually, my final story at the New York Times about Apple, not my final story, but my final story about Apple was about the government subsidies to help build the biggest manufacturing center, I think, in history, which is Foxconn's 300 or 350,000 worker site in Henan, which makes all of our equipment, our iPhones, our iPads, our laptops. I use one too. So that was a government Apple program. So that makes it very difficult, whether you're a business, whether you're a student, whether you're a faculty member, the deteriorating relationship between the US and China has so many effects that we can't even contemplate now, because it affects everything that we do because of all the globalization and integration of our supply chains in our universities.
Yeah. When I was in China, when we went to Hong Kong, and I met with a pretty well-off entrepreneur. They had the family, was Chinese family, had a lot of real estate in Hong Kong, also Shanghai. Uh, the husband was had Canadian citizenship for whatever historical reason, but he'd gotten that. And
Hmm.
he's in Hong Kong telling me over lunch that he's afraid to actually go into the mainland.
Mm. Yes.
He'll be picked up partly because, he's Canadian and the Canadians have held Hawaii's daughter uh, for, illegally, I guess, engaging in commerce with Iran. I guess that's the story. And then, could they take him captive, whatever, to as a hostage to get uh, this person released? But just in general, he said the atmosphere is one of fear. And uh, one of the Chinese professors I spoke with, who was at one of the local universities, I can't even say the name of the universities anymore because, for fear that person could get into trouble, uh,
Right. Right.
was saying that the anybody born outside of China, anybody with like a foreign passport, those
Mm.
faculty were leaving and being replaced by mainland Chinese faculty in Hong
Mm.
Kong, and this was lowering the average quality of the faculty. So, yeah, this is having profound implications. Do you think that you know a lot about uh, China is so much involved because I mean to begin with, they own every square inch of land in China, right? So you
Hmm.
really can't set up any kind of a facility or do any business without having a landlord being the Chinese government. And but I guess what people don't know is exactly uh, how the relationship works. If I'm, let's say, a major company in the US, I don't have any production happening in China. Maybe it's in different, I've got production in Mexico or Bolivia or Malaysia, but I want to operate in China. What do I have to go through to make that happen? Is that easy? Do I then get kind of locked into dealing with the government forever? Because we have had successful ventures here, like you were just describing. Apple's been an enormous successful venture with China, which we're kind of blowing that possibility up, that potential of trade uh,
Right.
in real time. So tell everybody exactly how these things work, because
Yeah.
you know the inside scoop.
Right. Maybe just a quick sweeping lesson is think of it as you probably remember 1989 Tiananmen Square, the crackdown on student protesters, and there were lots of companies forced to pull out. There were sanctions on the Chinese government. This is 1989. The economy is not very developed, but not too long after, 1992, Deng Xiaoping travels to the South and he says, we're actually going to open more to capitalists. We're going to bring in foreign investment in a bigger way. And I think in the early to mid 90s, you had China basically, inviting foreign companies, and things would get much better by, say, 97 when the Hong Kong handover took place. So I would say from 97 maybe up until 2014, 15, the welcome mat was out. American companies were encouraged. We'll give you cheap land. You can lease a factory. We'll give you tax rebates. You can charge your labor force for factories. When I got to China in 2004, the typical factory worker that I visited was making 20 cents an hour. Um, and so it was just like, think of $100. A lot of these people were $100 a month they were making to work in your factory. So there was this big, rush where everyone was building in China. The government could be your partner, but also a private company could. The local governments would say, hey, why don't you build here? Why don't you open here? We'll give you free space in the factory. So things were amazingly welcoming and open, and foreign investment was flowing in. And all of that only started to really change, I would say, in my final years in China after Xi Jinping came to power. And part of it was China had grown up and developed the greatest economic boom in history for any country, right? where they didn't need foreign investment anymore. And also, they were starting to say, we don't just want foreigners to locate here for low-end factories. We want to take those companies, to challenge those companies, to, in many cases, steal their IP if we can, to do what they're doing. And we will move up the value chain from we will make your toys and your t-shirts to no, we will sell you Huawei phones or telecom gear, or lots of other companies came. And so those companies would lobby the Chinese government. Why are you letting all these foreigners take these positions in our country? So it's become, for many different reasons, national security, but also strategically, competition. It's not the same as it was. And I would say by the time I was leaving China, just about any company that wanted to manufacture in China was probably already there, right? I remember trying to look at story ideas and saying, who is not in China? And I went to the Gap and said, why is the Gap not in China? Of course, they came to China. So everyone that could manufacture, you think banks were not in China because that was difficult. Some telecom was not in China in a big way because the Chinese government would not allow them to run the telecom system. So there were sensitive industries, but almost just about any manufacturer, in fact, almost everything Apple produced by hand was made in China. And you can go HP, IBM, they all had factories. So it was the factory floor of the world. And today that is changing. They are still the factory floor of the world, but they're more Chinese managed and owned factories. They are competing with the best global companies, as you know, with DeepSeek, with drones, with solar, with so many things. All the
Yeah.
manufacturing know-how went there, and they,
Jetliners.
yes, that's right.
Right.
They're trying to compete with the Boeing and Airbus.
Yeah. So we've heard so much about, I mean, just well, one thing about the US policy to try and put on tariffs with everybody and become a manufacturing country again. That's what Trump said. We're going to be manufacturing country again. So right now, 7% of our workforce is in manufacturing. It was 30% in 1950. Yes, China's and other parts of the developing uh, world have improved economically, and their wages are relatively higher compared to what they were, but they're still probably 25% of ours. So their productivity level, so things are still so much cheaper to produce in China vis-a-vis the US, let alone Vietnam and Malaysia and Brazil and everywhere else. The notion that we're going to go from, start producing our own clothes. We import 98% of our textiles, our own shoes. We don't think we have any shoe manufacturers left, maybe a couple. Furniture. I mean, this is just air, leaf blowers. All that stuff can be produced so much cheaper than. Uh, it- how do you respond to something like that when you hear it?
Yeah.
I just think it's the ravings of somebody who's got no connection to reality.
Right, right. So Larry, actually, it's great to have you on this discussion because this is a question that I've thought about long before Trump and when I was in China, which is the debate about um, so much manufacturing was moving to China and Asia, and lots of people were coming and saying, "Is this too much? Is America losing its manufacturing base?" And from my understanding, most economists would argue this is not coming back to America. Even Steve Jobs said, like, these jobs are not coming back. Um, but it seems in the last few years, take Trump out of this, because I don't think this is really about Trump.
Mhm.
It's about to what extent will America, will the United States be involved in manufacturing? Not, I don't think anyone would argue that they would be in making toys again or t-shirts or even sneakers. Um, but what I've heard more and more after I left China is because everyone moved their manufacturing, high end and low end. The US and Europe and other parts of the world have lost their manufacturing know-how. And it means that things like when you're developing drones, which China's the leader in, that they have, because they have so many skills at so many different levels, they can do everything there. I also heard a great story the other day, um, about TSMC and about how Morris Chang, the world's most advanced semiconductor firm, that he was at Texas Instruments. He was an American. He
The Taiwanese company, right?
Yes, the Taiwanese company, now the biggest in the world, the most advanced chips. He ended up building his company from scratch in Taiwan, not in mainland China, in Taiwan, not in America. And people said, why is this? And he said, actually, in the US, the PhDs and the other very smart people that I met did not want to work in a factory and did not want to build things. When I went to Taiwan, obviously they didn't have as many opportunities. They were very much into the technicians. And I bring this up because Steve Jobs mentioned it too when they said, why don't you move some of that manufacturing back to the US? And Steve Jobs, and they still argue, I think Apple is, there's a lot of technical skill, not the low like stitching and knitting, but the technical skills that America has lost. And so the question I think hangs out there to this day for economists like you and experts in manufacturing is, um, America is not going to it's not going to redo what it did like 100 years ago, but has when it reevaluates manufacturing and production, is there something in moving everything to the lowest cost place that you've lost as a country, that not having it means you're not producing your own pharmaceuticals, you're importing them from China, you're importing your vaccines, you also don't have the know-how for all of this equipment to develop it, and that China has developed unbelievable skills. You probably saw the numbers lately of their manufacturing dominance globally. Like, it's going to be impossible, it looks like, for anyone to compete with China anytime. There's not going to be another China because they're so far ahead. So my question actually back at economists and experts is, okay, America's not going to bring back the low manufacturing. They don't want to import like low stuff and produce it, but have they lost the middle to high ground in manufacturing? Is that going to continue to move away from the US? And is that going to mean you can't even hope to be back in the game in certain areas? By the way, when I was covering when Boeing was moving in agreement with China, more and more of its manufacturing of Boeing was the number one export, by the way. When I was looking at the trade data, it was agriculture and Boeing. If
Mm.
Boeing started to say, well, we'll start with the aluminum sidings and then we'll do, and China said, well, we now want you to do some engines. So if it was soon that even high-end manufacturers were being lured to say, you have to produce it in China, then I don't have the technicians in the US. I lose the skills. We become the ideas factory in the US, but China makes everything, and that gives them a supreme advantage.
Yeah, I think, there's a famous paper by Ken Arrow, who's one of the top, Kenneth Arrow is one of the Nobel Prize winner in economics and one of the all-time great economists. He had a paper about learning by doing. And if you're not doing, you can't necessarily, you're not learning how to innovate. And certainly knowledge is a public good, so that when you uh, don't, when you're not making even shoes, you can't figure out how to make them better. And you can't pass that on to people in other, conferences, shoemaking conferences, and pass it on to your kids and all that knowledge. And now, could manufacturing come back to the US? It could become in the form of robots. It could be that we have factories with no humans. I was a couple of years ago in Scotland and went to a tour a Scotch factory. It was making Scotch. Okay, so beautiful beautiful brewery, huge tanks, and then there's five guys in a glass office. And the gal who was taking us on the tour says there used to be 250 workers in this space. There's only five. They're right over there. And this was really about 5 years ago. It's actually 2019. Uh, and and they're controlling everything. Everything's being done automatically. This is before the AI revolution. And I thought to myself, and she was very proud of it. And I thought to myself, in a couple of years, we'll come back and she'll be a robot. She'll be walking around giving the
Mm,
tour. So that could be a transformation. But you're right. The knowledge, how to build the all that. It's not to say we can't bring it together. We can't figure out uh, how to. We have a lot of well-educated people, except now we've got an attack on the universities by this administration to a large extent. We're keeping the best foreign minds from coming and staying.
yeah,
So the idea of restricting immigration to everybody when you should actually be importing all that human capital and retaining it. If you look at the top uh, tech companies in our country, many of these people are from abroad, right? Musk is
right,
from South Africa, right?
right.
Uh, he's the richest guy in the world. Should we have kept him out of the country? Well, many people would say yes at this point, now that he's doing Nazi salutes, but in public. But apart from that, he's made some big, helped involve, make some great breakthroughs technologically speaking, including getting to space. So, uh, one thing I wanted to ask you is, to what extent do you think China's success is connected to stealing our ideas, as opposed to just observing our ideas? I have a friend who's got some factories in China, and uh, he actually took me for a tour of them. And one of the things he said was, "You're going to go and meet the head of this company, and they're making X, and which, by the way, we don't. They're much better than the X in the U.S. Uh, and uh, by the way, he doesn't speak English." I said, "How come?" He said, "Well, I purposely found somebody who was very bright and very good, capable, but I didn't want him to speak English because I knew he would be poached by some other Chinese company, or he would take the idea and be able to set up his own, uh, learn be able to set up his own factory, connect with a foreign investor via speaking English, and compete with me." I thought that was very clever, but uh, give me an answer to your question. Is there any way of quantifying the amount by which China's success connects to stealing from the US or IT?
Yeah. Here's how I would describe it, a little more complex, which is
IT, I meant.
yes,
Yeah.
they are in my 12 years there, I could just see almost every day massive theft. That's part of the game. But I would say overemphasizing their theft, which is, in many cases, the US companies left the doors open and they stole things. And so it's way more than theft, though. And of course, lots of developing countries thieve, and the Chinese Communist Party helps them steal. So I don't want to downplay that
When you say theft, I mean, give us a concrete example that you observed.
Oh, I think I didn't write about it, but I can't remember if it's the F-35 or one of the fighter jets that they actually cyber hack into these top companies, get their designs and recreate almost down to the level like this is the exact plane. And there's like thousands of examples. I remember one of the stories I did write was about one of the Chinese scientists who created one of their early microchips. He was hailed as a hero, all over the country. And some 5 years later, someone was using one of the microchips and scratched off and found it's actually a Motorola chip on there. So everyone has stories about, I've been to the Nike copycat factories, the ones that steal from the Nike factories. the designs, the equipment, all this stuff, but also the ones that just figure out a way to just make the same design. So China is known for theft in every single area. Every company will tell you stories. We've written about solar company thefts. So there's like humongous amount of evidence of Chinese theft. And that's well known. So I'm not saying anything new. I think what's actually more interesting is in the last 5 or 10 years, they've gone from just stealing things to saying, we're actually going to adapt and apply and make it fit into the Chinese context or build R&D on top of that. So and there's so many companies that, to be honest, even me and my editors and others were like, well, China is so good at just copying Google. They have a Google company, Baidu is Google, and all the companies are like a copy of the US too. Well, how did then ByteDance come out? That's not a copy of any American company, even though it's in social media. So they have the top in drones. They can steal at the beginning, but they can also adapt. And I think by looking at it in the way I'm looking at it in this lens is China has really smart people, hardworking entrepreneurs, very creative, get around the rules, actually get around the rules of the Communist Party to develop things. So I really think we should think of them as, yes, they've copied and stolen a lot, but they are supremely capable in every field.
Okay,
And
so this brings me to kind of the kind of long run picture here. So I wrote a paper with some colleagues, actually Russian colleagues and some grad students called The Future of Global Economic Power, where we have a large scale economic model. We simulated uh, out 500 years. We've got demographics, fiscal policy, productivity growth, uh, fertility, mortality, the whole works very carefully done. And it shows that by the end of the century, China has about, under conservative assumptions, a quarter of the world output. We're at around 11%. India is about 11%. So China and India together are close to about 40% of world GDP. Under some projections, if you use like last 20-year productivity growth rates, you get to about those two countries having 60% of world output. So given that they don't necessarily need us to survive, what we're in a situation where they're going to become the economic hegemons. We don't seem to understand that here in the U.S. We think we are going to be on the top of the the tree here, but we're being pulled down. I mean, their navy is larger, their army is many times larger.
yeah,
They're right next to Taiwan if they want to take it. And it seems to be like being offered up to them. If you're the president, what would you do? And I mean,
yeah,
we're going to become to the world economy like Germany is to the world economy today. So,
right.
given that reality, shouldn't we just accept it that we're not going to be the global hegemon? I'm not saying that means we should leave NATO or sell out Ukraine, but
Yeah.
fighting with China, it seems like we should be making deals with China.
Right. Well, I also think it's a pretty scary prospect if China has those sorts of numbers under the Communist Party. I think that's what people. It's not just a worry of they're going to be a strategic competitor and they're going to be bigger than the U.S. The economy in many ways is already larger than the U.S. economy. It's what kind of leadership. And I'm not an expert in the Communist Party, but I've spent a lot of years looking at them, and that's a big problem for the U.S. But if we take aside the politics and human rights and what they do in the world, um, the competitiveness, if they're that large, and I have some questions about whether they'll actually fulfill those expectations, um, is pretty like tremendous. And that's why I think almost everyone should be, well, when they could, visiting China and seeing their capabilities. This country is phenomenal, despite the Communist Party holding them back in many ways. I mean, the Communist Party, I think, is not a plus for China's development, even though it may have been in opening the doors and doing some things. I think it actually holds them back from, if there were real competition and rule of law in China, man, could you imagine where they would be today with intellectual property rights for Chinese companies and real competition and less corruption and more private enterprises? They're holding back the Jack Ma's and the great entrepreneurs of China by making them more state oriented or saying the state is going to control something. So I think, to answer your question, I think the US should be concerned. It doesn't mean you're going to completely stop this, but you want this country to be competitive with China, to not let any one country just completely dominate the global economy. I mean, even you were talking about like way down decades away, but even if you look at now, the manufacturing numbers, what China is dominating, the overcapacity numbers. I don't know if you've heard in the last year or two, but the economists are talking about China flooding the market so that they actually destroy industries because their real estate market is so bad. So there's also the concern,
Lots of unemployment around young,
not
like
just
20%.
right, not just competitiveness, but would you want you wouldn't want the US to flood the world and own 80% of every major industry. And so we don't want China to do that either, or India or any other place. So I think the US should really be trying to understand, what does it mean if China even hits some of these goals? Um, could they also decide, well, now that we're much bigger than you, we're withholding your vaccines, your critical minerals, your other things. We're not going to allow you to get semiconductor parts. So everything the US is doing now in the competition with China, imagine they have their own sanctions regime. They have their own, we just don't like you. We just feel like you're not going to get certain supplies. So I think for that national security reason too, I would want the US competing really strongly with China at the high end, as you said, great universities, luring talent from overseas, giving them, I would give them citizenship, obviously do a background check, but all of these great people from around the world that increase our talent pool. But I would also say, it seems to me from what I saw in China and what we've seen in the global economy, I would want the US to be a manufacturing power for national security reasons, but also for economic and strategic reasons, but not in the comical, we're going to make sneakers and t-shirts, as I said, but we're going to have the capabilities to do lots of things and have those skills and think the way the Japanese do about manufacturing, prizing manufacturing, not just the idea, but the actual work with your hands. And you've probably heard this saying lately, but they say the US is great at 0 to 1, but China's great at 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. You come up with the idea, right? But we're going to take that idea and put it to work because we actually have the tools, the equipment, the factories. You just have the idea. So there's a lot you can do from 1 to 4. And in many ways, Steve Jobs built Apple by not always 0 to 1, but by saying great phone technologies, great these other, I'm just going to combine them. I'm going to take these ideas and put them together in a new way. And China is really good at doing that. So I would be concerned about their ability at 1 to 4.
So, yeah, I'm concerned too. I think the question is how to express our concern. We're turning China into an enemy, whether, relative to where we were 10 years ago, an
Mm-hmm.
adversary. We're now turning Europe into an adversary to a large extent.
Yep.
We just sided with Belarus, Russia, and North Korea at the UN. It's a very strange companionship there. Is our policy? It's one thing to protect your property rights. It's another thing to deride China
Yeah.
as the evil empire. you know, I think we're just I think we're just approaching this wrong. I think the only way we can succeed is to cooperate with China, not to make them into an enemy. Because I think, if they go to Chile and say, look, we've just been hit with tariffs and we're having a trade war with the US, and you've just been hit with tariffs too from the US. Trade with us. You're already trading 4 times more with us than you are with the US. Uh, you're exporting 4 times more to us than you are to the US. Here's your deal. You either trade with us exclusive. If you trade with the US, forget trading with us. That's your deal.
Hmm.
Here's one or the other because we've had it with the US. It seems to me if they go country to country, they're going to win that competition. And then
Yeah.
we just, unless you have a president whose design is to, or his objective is to destroy the US economy, uh,
Hmm.
you don't go that path. You don't get into that kind of a fight where you're not equipped to win.
Yeah. This is a great issue, Larry. I'm glad you brought it up. It's so complex. So, in one sense, I'd like to say, obviously, I want a country in America that has a rule of law that respects the rights. I don't want to demonize like the evil empire of China. Um, but at the same time, from my experience, let me tell you, China is it goes around the world trying to undermine the US. So it's not as if you're going to have like, we would love to engage with China, and China's like, great, we would love to engage with you, big brother. No, they want the US destroyed. They want the US weaker so that they can have that leverage. And Mearsheimer and others will say that's just natural that great powers want to weaken the other for leverage. So even if you say it's not about good or evil, it's just we want to be an equal to the US and or we want to be bigger than the US and we'll be able to dictate the terms. But the Communist Party does not like democracy, does not like human rights, does not like many of the things that the US stands for pre-Trump. And so they are, if you when you say engage, it has to be, in my mind, not naive engagement, because we did a lot of naive engagement with China, and China can take advantage of those things. It has to be, well, where do you want to engage on climate change, on important issues? You of course you want to have diplomacy, but I think also one of the challenges that the U.S. has faced is on economic policy. I kind of think, and I'm not an economist as you are, but I kind of think the US for decades was weak on trade and economic policy with China. When you look at the figures, they are, and I know economists say, well, it goes to where the cheapest, it's not always China, but I just think the trade deficits with China, the dominance, the we will open our market to Chinese goods, but China will say, no Yahoo, no Google, no tech companies. We'll let a couple of brands. Like it's a very uneven engagement. And I think actually the companies, the American companies, would have done much better if the US had said, China, you will have to give our American companies as good at terms. Not you give them good terms when you want them to transfer technology, but you give us access to your market, we give you access to our market. That has not gone well for the US. And also, um, I watch all the Chinese propaganda TV programs, and they're not friendly in those things. They actually like the US in a disorderly state, just like Putin does. Remember, Xi Jinping is the partner of Putin, right? We're going to help you along. They want
Right.
to see a weaker US. So I know the US looks very messy now, but I'm really saying also think about China is not exactly welcome wagon and we will be your friend and everything will be wonderful. It is actually a weaker US is good for us. The Communist Party does not like US politicians, does not like democracy. And Huawei and ZTE go around the world and make these deals so that we can spy on the US. That's why they have military companies operating with them overseas. So I think we should also look at China with open eyes and recognize, yes, engagement. I'm not for disengagement, but I'm for smart engagement and thoughtful in a balanced system and not caving.
Okay. So let me ask you this kind of final question, which is, do you think we're engaging in a smart way? It seems like across the board tariffs, uh, I could see if they are critical. So what we've done so far is led the Chinese to uh, put on an export ban on rare earth metals, from what I understand, and
Yep,
probably
yep,
other
yep, yep,
critical metals.
yep.
That impacts our battery, and now we're trying to go and blackmail Ukraine to give us half of their rare earth metal supply. This has, I guess the question is whether there was a different way to tell China we need to protect ourselves from losing these industries are vital, and we're not going to call you a bad guy. You're out for your interests. We're out for our interests. But the level of rhetoric from people
Yep.
like Navarro
Yeah.
seems to me, it seems to me that the rhetoric, my view of history is it's a history of psychopaths, and that
Mm,
we have or extremists that people take over who just are uh, ideologues, and then they go overboard, and then they piss off the other side who goes overboard,
mm.
and you end up with everything boiling down.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think actually this is a good way maybe to end.
I call it history of irrationality,
Yeah, yeah,
irrational history. Yeah.
right. This is maybe a good way to end, which is I think maybe the most important thing that we can think about in the future, which is it's pretty clear a lot of the problems between in the relationship between the US and China. We could make a whole list of those problems over national security, over economics, over trade. What are the solutions? And that's where we need great minds and experts at, you know, economists like you and others to give us directions on what is we let's make sure we understand what is the problem. There is a trade problem. Are tariffs really the solution? Is this just a quick political fix, etc.? Sanctions have been debated very strongly. Some people think like you've got to put on these sanctions. Others argue that actually you're making it worse with the sanctions. I don't think I have any great definitive answers, but I do see like this is the most important time for great reporting on China and the US to really understand what the issues are and try to confront them, and balanced reporting so that we can really get the best views to come to solutions. I don't have a lot of the solutions, but what I love about the job that I have now in being not only in news but in data is can we try to get at some of those really critical points between the US and China and say, let's look at, as an economist, let's look at the data. Let's see what it says. And then let's find really smart people that say, let's game this out and look at different scenarios. What are the things that we should be thinking about in terms of improving US standing in manufacturing or national security, but also in understanding the issue with China and not simplifying it to I don't like the Chinese, or I'm married to a Chinese woman, by the way. So I am a big fan of China and the Chinese people. But I also realize these tension points have been a long time in coming, and not many people have had great solutions to making it better because you have two very, Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, they don't have that outward presence the way the US politicians do, but they're
Or
hardliners.
used to.
Yeah, they
And
used
that's
to.
really-
Yes, but they're hardliners. So navigating Xi and Trump, wow, this is one of the big challenges for the next 4 years is these two, and you can throw Putin in there too, three really powerful figures that like to act as dictators. How are you going to deal with them, and how are they going to deal with one another? So that I'm sorry I can't answer your questions with any just perfect solutions, but I think this is the challenge for all of us to figure out point by point, what is the best path forward?
Yeah. Well, let's hope that we have some sound minds. Maybe you'll get called in to give some advice, although this group seems to know everything already. But thanks so much, David. Fascinating conversation. We're going to hope to have you back shortly on Economics Matters, and take care.
Great to be with you. Thank you.